Living for We is not just a podcast. It's a journey into the lived experiences of Black women in Cleveland, Ohio. In 2020, a shocking study by City Lab placed Cleveland at the bottom for livability of Black women. Living for We host Marlene Harris-Taylor alongside her team at Ideastream Public Media and Evergreen Podcasts work to unpack the stories of marginalization, revealing the struggles in workplaces, schools, and healthcare. On this episode of Evergreen Spotlight, Marlene tells us more about how she and her team spearhead the eye-opening and award-winning podcast, Living for We. Marlene, thank you for joining us here at the studio. We could have really done this virtually, but we're so happy to have you in studio.
Oh, well, I'm so happy to be here, Julie. I love coming to the Evergreen studio. It's almost like a little second home for me. I was here so much.
Thank you. And, you know, we're really talking about Cleveland. We're here in Cleveland. And perhaps you could tell us about the livability aspect for Black women in Cleveland and how it started and really what started this whole project for you and your team.
Yeah. So, you know, this project was just so personal to me as a Black woman to be able to share this data about what's going on with Black women in Cleveland. And really, to be honest with you, Julie, the research project that sort of like kicked this all off, that Pittsburgh study that we heard about in Cleveland, that named Cleveland the least livable city for Black women. Well, when we spoke to the researcher who was in charge, she said, really, it's Midwest cities, like Detroit, Columbus, you name it, all the Midwest cities, Chicago, they were all very close. It's just that, you know, statistically, Cleveland ended up at the bottom. So to get back to your original question as to what started this for me, working at Ideastream, I've been working on health disparity issues for women for years, particularly for Black women. And when we thought about doing a podcast, we thought about so many issues that impact Black women in Cleveland. As we all know, the infant mortality rate for Black women in Cleveland has been abysmal for years. There's been movement, it's gotten better, but it's still really, really bad. The maternal mortality rate and so forth, right? And so this project that we were working on was called Connecting the Dots Between Race and Health. And as we thought about all these different things that are happening in Cleveland, then we heard about that study that found Cleveland the least livable city. And we thought, oh my gosh, this study just encapsulated everything that we've been talking about. And that would be a great jumping off point for the podcast. So that was really our beginning focus.
You mentioned these Midwest cities. Is there something that they all have in common of why they are rated least livable?
Well, what the researchers said is sort of these like legacy, what do you call them, industrial cities, right, where there's these big income inequality gaps in these communities. And really, that's at the heart of a lot of these health disparity issues. I don't care which one you pick. You know, you pick them A to Z. When you really boil it down as to what's causing this or what's behind it, it's really that income inequality gap.
Can you describe really what the experience is for a woman in Cleveland, a Black woman in Cleveland, going to the hospital, going through school, in the workplace? Can you like take us there and what that's like for her?
Yeah. So, you know, I have to give a shout out to Chi-Chi and Bethany of Enlightened Solutions, the two researchers that we worked with here in Cleveland. After we heard about the Pittsburgh study, Chi-Chi and Bethany had picked up that research and they started interviewing women here in Cleveland. They opened up a survey on their website and just asked, you know, Black women to chime in. What's your experience like in all these areas that you just mentioned? Is it true to what we heard in this study? And overwhelmingly, what they heard from women who wrote into this survey is, unfortunately, yes, that's my experience. And so we heard from women from all walks of life in the podcast. But when we focused a couple episodes on healthcare in particular, oh my God, Julie, the stories we heard were just incredible about women who found themselves in the hospital with healthcare workers who just would not listen to them. And that's been a problem over and over again, is that often women who are African-American women are marginalized. So the healthcare workers say, yeah, okay, well, let me tell you what's really wrong with you. Or they just ignore them altogether. So we heard some harrowing stories about people who almost lost their lives, a woman who went through a miscarriage and was just left in a room alone and nobody came in to tend for her. In the workplace, we heard stories about microaggressions. You know, that's the big word right now, right?
Yes,
Microaggressions.
Yeah.
And with microaggressions, it's really interesting because, like, we all know prejudice when we see it, right? When it's like that overt kind of prejudice, that's very easy to say, oh my gosh, that's terrible.
Like it's obvious. It's something that,
obvious.
you can definitely call out. But the microaggression is something that's a little bit more subtle.
It's very
right?
subtle, right? So, and I'm sure you've experienced this as a woman.
As a woman, I have, yes.
Yeah, in the work. So you know what I mean? It's sort of, you think it's happening, but you don't really know for sure. And you start to question yourself and you wonder, so you sort of gaslight yourself in a way and convince yourself, well, it couldn't be that. It's got to be these other things. But in the end, there really are a lot of microaggressions. And so the women talked about that and what they've experienced in the workplace. And one woman who is a businesswoman who has all kinds of awards and accolades here in Cleveland, she talked about being the only African-American woman who was given a grow license from the state of Ohio to sell marijuana in Ohio. And she actually, it was not microaggressions in her case. She received phone calls at home telling her, you might want to get out of this. You might think about this. There were people who were upset that she was given that license to grow marijuana because it was under one of these programs that was trying to help minority businesses grow. And they felt, I guess, I can't get in their head. I guess maybe they felt it wasn't fair that she received, because there was a limited number of licenses, right? And so she received threats over the phone, people trying to convince her to drop that business.
Thank you for sharing that story. What do you think is the solution? Like, really, truly, what is the solution? How can we as the public know better of how to treat people? I can't believe I have to say that like this year and this time, but really, what is the solution, not only for Cleveland, but for these other major cities?
Julie, that's such a big question. I mean, how much time you got?
I don't know. Noah, how much time do we have? No.
Well, let me say this. There's sort of like layers of solutions, if you will. So one of the things we wanted to do with Living for We is we wanted to be, like, this topic can be very heavy.
Yeah.
And, it can bring people down, right? And we didn't want people to leave the podcast like feeling depressed and, oh my gosh, throwing up their hands, there's nothing we could do about this. So our goal, the team behind it, was to make sure this podcast was empowering, that we leave women with hope. Right? And so we had Dr. Angela Neal Barnett, who's a psychologist from Kent State University. She was in several of the episodes and talking about what we've heard and giving women some real tools that they could use, like some positive thinking techniques, some way to basically help themselves feel better as they're working their way through these situations. So that's one solution on a really base level that women can do themselves, the empowerment.
Sure.
And one of the themes that we heard throughout is women helping women. And it was so glorious to hear about one woman helping another woman overcome a situation. And that's one of the solutions, is that women have to work together. Black women have to work together. If the society will not lift us up, we'll work together to lift each other up.
There's almost like a community that can be built even from this podcast, Living for We. It's almost like, let's talk about this together. Can I have an outreach call with someone who knows, about this? So it's almost like this seed planting of even a community around your podcast.
Exactly, because so many women talked about their girlfriend chat groups and how they talk about different topics in those chat groups. But the bigger societal, how do we fix this? That's a biggie. It really, again, it comes back to to your point, just treating each other with respect, understanding that we all have contributions to make to this society, and not assuming because there's a woman or a Black woman in a position that she must have gotten that because of this, that, or the other. She must be the affirmative action hire, right? Not assuming those things and just treating people as individuals.
I think we would love to know really what episodes have struck you and who you've been able to speak with and what you've been able to take away from that specific episode. Yeah,
well, as I mentioned, we spoke to Black women from all walks of life in Cleveland, but one of the episodes that really struck me was the episode that featured Tamir Rice's mother. And people may remember, I'm sure, that tragic story of he was 12 years old, playing with a toy gun. Yeah. Police came on the scene. They didn't know. They thought he was a grown person, and they just reacted really quickly and killed him. And so Samaria has been, she's been in public before as they went through like civil trials with the city of Cleveland, but I felt like people hadn't really heard from her much. Often you would see the attorneys talking and she was standing there. And so I thought, wow, it would be wonderful to hear from her just as a mother and what her life has been like since then and how she's coping and what she thinks of the study. And not so much about the tragic incident. So through a friend, I was able to connect with her attorney, and I called her, and she didn't know me at all. And I just explained the project to her, and she immediately said she wanted to be a part of it. And so I was just like thrilled that she felt comfortable and safe to share her thoughts with us. So she lives between Cleveland and North Carolina now. And you could just hear in her voice the pain that she's dealt with all these years. And you also heard from her that she still feels like Cleveland has not treated her family right or done the reconciliation it needs to do around her son's death. Because when I asked her what was her message to Black women in Cleveland, she was very blunt, and she said, "Get out." She doesn't feel like there's any changing the city. But then later on, she did talk about that she felt that there might be some opportunities for Black men to do more protecting of Black women. Because because it's a theme that you hear if you're online and in certain spaces, you'll hear Black women saying that Black women are the least protected women in this country. Right. And because of a series of things that, societal things, a long list that's a whole nother conversation. Right. Black men often aren't in the position to protect Black women, and those that are sometimes don't. And so she was saying, in these communities that are plagued by crime and gangs and so forth, she just asked a simple question. She said, where are the men? Where are the Black men? Where are the role models for these young men who are joining gangs and so forth? So I just thought she was very intelligent. I thought her comments were very provocative and informed. So I really, really enjoyed having a chance to talk with her. Now, on the other end of the scale, we spoke to a 93-year-old woman in town. And she used to be a nurse, and she's retired now. And I just knew her through my mother, because she grew up in the same hometown as my mother. Her name is Arnell Hendricks, Miss Arnell, we called her. And she was so funny. She was hilarious.
Just sharing her experiences.
And how, she talked about her life as a nurse. And you can imagine, 94 years old, going through nursing school in Cleveland, what that must have been like, right, for her. And it was amazing. She grew up in... I don't know what that would be. I'm not even sure. It was in the 40s. Yeah. Wow. And she grew up in this tiny town in Arkansas, the same town my mom is from. And the high school gave out scholarships for college. And I think she said it was like $200 or something like that. And that paid for her nursing school back then. Wow. But and so she went through a lot of things when she went through nursing school. But she did have, a middle-class life, if you will, right, with her husband. And they were able to raise their children in Shaker Heights. They were one of the first Black families in Shaker Heights. But when she talked about her granddaughter, she was so funny. She said, well, my granddaughter, she's dating a white guy. And she's like, I'm okay with that.
Oh, good. I'm glad she's come around.
She's come around. She's like, I think it's wonderful. She says, I just think people should just be open to dating whoever is good for them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about your background. You know, you're the director of engaged journalism at Ideastream. That's a humongous title.
It is.
And you feel it.
I say it is because people don't know what it is. They're like, what is that? Everybody asks me, what is that?
Well, and you have, your background in journalism and television, a little bit in radio from my understanding, and then you bring in podcasting. So I just wanted to know, how do you like podcasting? How does it relate? What do you like the best? Not even for the art of podcasting, but as far as media in general, do you have a favorite medium?
I love podcasting. In fact, creating this podcast, working with the team here at Evergreen and the team at Ideastream has been one of the best experiences in my career, I have to say. And I have worked in radio for many years, primarily for public media. Yeah. For NPR affiliate stations, I've worked at PBS. I hosted a television show on PBS, the PBS affiliate in Bowling Green for years. I worked in newspapers as a reporter. I've worked in video. I've created long-form documentaries. Wow. So I've kind of like done a little bit of everything. Yeah. I kind of joke and say I was a multimedia journalist before that was a thing, right?
Get it? That MMJ?
I was an MMJ before there was a thing. But I have to say that audio is my favorite. Like whether it's on radio, hosting, like doing what you're doing now, hosting the podcast, producing audio stories, because there's something about audio. There's a certain intimacy.
Exactly.
And a connection with the audience that's different from television, from newspapers. Yeah. Although I really enjoyed my career as a newspaper reporter too, because one thing about newspapers is usually when a newspaper is like the newspaper of record in a town, you have a lot of impact with your work.
Oh, wow.
Because if you write a story, people pay attention, and the people in power pay attention. So you feel like you're really making a difference.
Curious about the name Living for We, if you don't mind. Just curious how you guys came to that name. Yeah,
I mean, there was like a process to get there, to that title. That title actually came from one of our guests. Her name is Ramat Wiley, that's right. And Ramat is a local woman who opened a spice store in the Van Aken district, but she had a long journey to get there. And she was one of the first interviews that we did. And it was going on for a long time, and she needed a break. And when she went in the hallway here at Evergreen to take a break, she made that statement. She said, really what we're talking about is Black women kind of helping each other, living for each other, living for we, right? And we, loved it at the time, but we didn't think a lot about it, right? And then as we began to think about, when I say we, I mean the team that created the podcast, Hannah Leach, our producer, Hey Fran Hay, our creative director, the marketing team here at Evergreen, the marketing team at Ideastream. There was a lot of people.
Yeah, the whole team.
The whole team. Yeah. So we all sort of brainstormed titles, right? And we really just voted on it. And Living for We was suggested, I believe, by Hannah, I think, because she heard Ramat make that comment. And everybody just was drawn to it because, again, getting back to the idea of this podcast not being negative or a downer. We wanted a title that was more uplifting and empowering. And we thought Living for We fit the bill.
Marlene, it's such a pleasure. And thank you for giving just a little background into the podcast. I hope that listeners just find such value in learning about how to make the city more livable and how to make Cleveland better and other big cities in the U.S. So, Marlene, what sort of advice do you have for someone who wants to be a podcaster?
Yeah, well, this has been such a learning experience for me going through this. And one of the most important things I learned is how important the marketing of the podcast is. Because, anybody can make a podcast, as we know, right? There's people right now in their basements making podcasts that nobody except for their friends and their mother will hear. But even when you have resources behind a podcast, the marketing and the planning of when you want to drop the episodes and when you want to do your marketing campaign in relation to dropping those episodes is one of the biggest things that I learned, the biggest tools that I took away from this process.
One last question. What is something that you do every single time that you create one of the episodes?
Yeah. Well, this is actually probably advice, too, at the same time.
Good.
When you have scripts, when it's a scripted show, because ours is a mix of scripted and unscripted, you need to practice your scripts. You actually need to sit and read your scripts or read them out loud.
Yeah.
And that's something that I would do every time, because when you read the words out loud, it's different from looking at them on the page and just in your head. You'll find out there's certain words you might trip over and you might need to replace. So that's something I do. I read, no matter how many years I've been in this business, how experienced I am, I sit with the copy and read it out loud.
Such a good piece of advice, and from a journalist expert, truly. So thank you, Marlene, so much for being on Evergreen Spotlight. It is such a pleasure.
It's my pleasure.
Truly, and giving us a whole background into everything that you guys have done. Just a little sneak peek, so we appreciate that. Check out Living for We wherever you get your podcasts.